Hello everybody, welcome back to Octave11, Jojo here, and today we're talking with Zachary Casper, who's been researching and putting together a lot of information about Nibiru, the famous or infamous Planet X that a lot of us have heard about. So Zachary's here today to dive in and tell us all about what he knows about the Nibiru and the story. Take it away, Zachary. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much, Jojo. I'm doing fine. I'll just give a very brief background about myself. I was born in the United States, in the state of Texas, 73 years ago. My mother taught English at the University of Texas. My dad taught physics and astronomy. And I went to Canada in 1970. Actually, I left the United States Army early. I am also a Vietnam veteran, twice wounded in that very sad conflict. And I guess in recent decades, my focus has been on astrology, esoteric studies. I went to Asia in 1977 to study Buddhism, basically. But in the past few decades, my focus has been on astrology. I'm an astrologer of 50 years experience. I'm also heavily into religion, spirituality, esoteric studies, and for the past 10 years, I've been studying the subject of Nibiru, and that's what this lecture or discussion will be about today.
Fantastic. So Zachary's put a stack of slides together and images together, so we'll just get those up and you can talk through them as we go. Alrighty, so moving on to the slideshow. Take it away. Zachary?
Okay, well, we're going to be talking about some very interesting matters during this podcast. And it's information which has been suppressed by the powers that be. They don't want you or me or the masses to know about it. The slide in front of us shows the origin of the interstellar visitor Nibiru, which was somewhere in the constellation Orion. And that is near the astrological constellation of Gemini, as you can see from the star map. So next slide, please. Okay, this is very important. Excuse me,
Can I just ask quickly, Zachary, why they don't want us to know? Why do they want to keep it hidden from us?
That would be the subject of perhaps the second podcast about the cover-up. I couldn't cover the cover-up at this point, but that will become perhaps a little more clear as we go through this lecture, this presentation. All right, friends, whoever is looking at this podcast from whatever part of the world, from whatever nation, from whatever background, we have to acknowledge your freedom to think for yourself. You have the free will to come to your own conclusions about any subject. Now, this is very, very important. In fact, if you want to look at it from a spiritual angle, it is your God-given right, the gift of the Creator to yourself as a human being. And never forget that you are endowed with this precious gift. No matter what governments want to tell you, or the medical establishment wants to tell you, or the scientific community wants to tell you, it is your choice to think for yourself. And therefore, you'll have to come to your own conclusions about what I present here in this podcast. Much of it is or will be controversial, and I emphasize the word controversial in terms of mass consciousness and verifiable science. Next slide, please. The body of this lecture, the vast body of this lecture, was obtained from the Zenith Talk website. And it has been running since 1995 by a lady named Nancy Lieder, who was of German ancestry, who is based in Wisconsin. She is a channel for extraterrestrial beings, the Zetas, and over that period of time, she has accumulated a vast body of information on just about every subject under the sun on her website. So I highly urge people who are looking at this podcast, check out the website when they have the time or inclination. Next slide, please. Okay, Nancy Leader is in contact with extraterrestrial beings known as the Zetas, and they come from a star system known as Zeta Reticuli, way out there in the galaxy somewhere in space. The image on the left is actual photograph of a Zeta extraterrestrial, and I'm not sure where that was obtained, but I do believe it's a genuine photo. The image on the right is a drawing of how the Zetas do look or might look. So this information is basically coming from extraterrestrial sources. Now, if anyone has a problem with that, too bad. That's where it comes from, and we have to judge it on its own merits. The validity, the inner logic of the information. Next slide, please.
So would you say, Zachary, that they would be the extraterrestrials that would be referred to as the Greys? Or are they different?
I suppose you could refer to them as such. So we'll go next slide, please. Okay. Now, I've been studying Zeta Talk information for a little over 10 years now. And I've come to a conclusion about their accuracy rating. They deserve an accuracy rating of about 90%. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes maybe a little less. And that means I do not view all the info on the website as the Word of God. And that's because about 10% of the info may be subject to some sort of error. But it's a very complex matter because we may have to wait for some weeks, months, or even years to verify whether any piece of Zeta Talk info is accurate or not. So it is a complex and sometimes confusing situation. Next slide, please. Okay, Nibiru is the most common name used for the interstellar visitor. And this word is of Sumerian or Chaldean origin. Now, today, a few current writers refer to it as Nemesis. It's also known as Planet X, and the search for Planet X is known to the astronomical and scientific community. Now, what they don't know, or rather dismiss as mere fantasy, is that Nibiru is Planet X. Nibiru is mentioned in the Old Testament Bible. It was called wormwood. In South America, the Spanish word commonly uses Hercolobus. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the basic data and composition of Nibiru. It's a strange hybrid. It's about 85% brown dwarf star. The rest is a planet where water is a predominant element. Now, if you're on the surface of Nibiru and looking up at the sky, it would appear to be cream-colored. Nibiru is occupied by a race of humanoid beings known as the Anunnaki. According to the information on Zeta Talk, they are larger than we humans. They're about 8 or 9 feet high. The Anunnaki interaction with humans during past transits of Nibiru is a very, very complex subject. We'll talk about that a little bit later further on. According to Zeta Talk, currently no contact between humans and Anunnaki is allowed. So it was in the past, it's not permitted now. Next slide, please. All right, the appearance of Nibiru. Nibiru was surrounded by a huge cloud of brown-colored dust, which obscures its visibility. That's because it's mainly a brown dwarf star. It has 2 major moons and several minor moon clusters or moon swirls. In space, it appears to resemble the form of a double helix. Nibiru has a long dust tail, brownish in color, which contains small rocks as well as the dust, and also petrol particles or petrol globules. The tail is highly magnetized and can swoop or waft, moving independently of Nibiru itself. And this is very important, as we'll see a little bit later on. That wafting tail can swoop, can waft, and it's creating a lot of changes on the Earth. Next slide, please. Okay, the above photo is of the Nibiru complex. The photo below is the Egyptian sun disk symbol, but that sun disk symbol is actually based on the appearance of Nibiru, which is below. And you'll find that sun disk symbol carved in many temples right around Egypt. I had the good fortune to visit the Temple of Dendera many years ago now, and that was all over. You can see the sun disk all over the roof and the pillars and whatever. So the Egyptians knew about it, as we'll see. Next slide, please. Nibiru is about 4 times the size of the Earth. Therefore, it's about as big as Uranus, whose diameter is a little more than 50,000 kilometers. And and Neptune is a little under 50,000 kilometers, it's 49,000 plus. So Nibiru is somewhere between the size of Uranus and Neptune. Next slide. The mass or density of Nibiru is said to be 23 times that of Earth, and that's an incredible figure. That's because it has less silica or sand than Earth, according to the Zetas. That means that the gravitational pull and electromagnetic field of Nibiru is far, far greater than that of Earth. But Zeta talk does not give a figure for how much bigger, and that is a critically important factor in the influence of Nibiru on the Earth, and that's what this lecture is all about. Next slide, please. Okay, Nibiru has a strange or eccentric interstellar orbit. That's in the shape of a huge ellipse or ovoid. One focus or turning point of the orbit is our own sun. The other focus or turning point is a dead star located far away in outer space. Now, the periodicity or time sequence it takes to return to the same point in its orbit is approximately 3,600 to 3,650 Earth years. I think it's probably closer to the 3,600 year figure, but it might be a little over that. Nibiru entered our inner solar system, according to Zeta Talk, in March 2003 on its latest transit, which is a slingshot or boomerang movement past the sun. So it's now headed out of the solar, we were told. Next slide, please. Okay, what happened the last time that Nibiru hit town or arrived in our inner solar system? And that was about 1,600 BC, or perhaps shortly earlier, not exactly sure. What happened then? Next slide. Well, for starters, there was a major eruption in the Aegean Sea. A volcano on the island of Thera, which we now know as Santorini, erupted. And this is a quote from Wikipedia. The island was the site of one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history, the Minoan Eruption, and sometimes called the Thera Eruption, which occurred about 3,600 years ago at the height of the Minoan civilization. That eruption wiped out the city of Akrotiri in southern Terra, and we have the ruins of that city preserved on Santorini, and the 2 slides there show frescoes, wall frescoes from the Akrotiri ruins. And I had the good fortune to visit those a few decades ago.
Well,
Next slide.
we see lots of evidence, don't we, Zachary, all over the world of structures and giant old statues or whatever that have been covered over in mud. So would that, like that?
Well, the thing is, if you want to get into a discussion of the early history of mankind, the before Christ, that would take hours, because there's so much information that this civilization, that civilization has been around for a long time, and we're only now scratching the surface. And I believe that some of that information was deliberately suppressed and covered up.
Well, a lot of history is, it's lies, isn't it? Just to for their narrative.
True. Okay, back to the Terra Santorini volcanic eruption during the last passage of Nibiru. That caused a gigantic tidal wave to form, which moved south, swept south, and then badly damaged or even destroyed the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. And you may know that the major city there was Knossos. Once again, from Wikipedia, it may have led indirectly to the collapse of the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, which is 110 kilometers or 68 miles to the south through a gigantic tsunami. Sir Arthur Evans in the early part of the 20th century. Next slide, please. Okay, down in Egypt, Moses, the leader of the Hebrews, was struggling with bad old Pharaoh. You've gone one slide too far. Got to go back. Back one slide, please. Yeah, there you go.
Whoop.
Okay, the big struggle between Moses and Pharaoh, subject of many movies. The photo I have here was taken from the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston playing Moses and Yul Brynner as the Pharaoh. Okay, 9 of the 10 plagues of Egypt from the Bible were related in one way or the other to the approach of Nibiru and its effect on Earth in that era, approximately 1600 BC, perhaps slightly earlier. Also, the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, which according to the Old Testament guided Moses and the Hebrews after they left Egypt and wandered in the desert. The cloud by day was the smoke from the eruption of Terra Santorini. Pillar of fire by night was the volcanic eruption. So we believe. Next slide, please. Now, nearby in old Chaldea and Samaria, and that's present-day Iraq, there was some interaction between humans and the Anunnaki, the inhabitants of Nibiru. Zenith states that some of the interaction was positive, but most of it was negative. It's a very complex subject. The Anunnaki are said to be about 8 or 9 feet in height, and some of them took advantage of humans by enslaving them. At that point in time, interaction was permitted, but it is not now, and that's very important to understand. According to Zenith, Samson of immense fame and strength in the Bible was the product of an Anunnaki father and a human mother, and that's where he got his super strength from. You may believe that or not, as you wish, but that's what they state. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, we go to China, and Nibiru was having an eye-popping effect on the climate and local landscape. And that's preserved in the Sichuan province Longhai pottery from the Samsung ancestral ruins site. And this is all part of a museum in northern China sponsored by Samsung. And you can see those photos there of the elongated ears and also elongated eyes. Now, the elongated ears refer to hearing clapping sounds or trumpets thundering in heaven caused by Nibiru's passage. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please.
Wow.
Now, go across the water in Japan, and we see ancient Jomon pottery depicting the sloshing of the waters on all sides of the island caused by the extreme tidal waves unleashed by the passage of Nibiru. Next slide, please. We also see there were extraterrestrial visitors who appeared. They are called the Dogu, that's the Japanese name for them, who helped care for survivors in Japan after the Nibiru passage. This is their representation of those ET visitors who came to help. Next slide, please. Photos of Nibiru. Okay. At this point in time, Nibiru has rounded the sun on its outward journey, and so it's only visible near or very close to the sun. That means it's usually only visible around sunrise or sunset at dawn or dusk on any given day. It only appears as a small speck of light, generally speaking. Now, because of that, some have dismissed the entire concept of the existence of Nibiru, claiming that it should be generally visible to the public at large, especially amateur astronomers. But that is not so according to Zenith. And now we're going to see some photos. Next slide. Okay, this was what was visible in China in late June of 2003. If you look at the between 4 and 5 o'clock position of the sun disk, you'll see a small speck of light. And that's Nibiru. 4 or 5 position as if the clock face was imposed on the surface of the sun. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more visible. This was New Zealand from March of 2011, a little over 10 years ago. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a photo taken by Eric Trump, who was the son of former president now, Donald Trump, in March 2018. Now, Eric Trump posted this twice on his social media page. You can see he did it in, this is from April, and you can see the sun rising over the Trump Golf Club, I believe, their golf course. Next photo, next slide. And this is what you can see in the close-up. Once again, there's something there approximately at the between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock position of the sun.
It looks
and
like
that is Nibiru.
It looks like a Q, doesn't it?
It does look like a Q, yes. Of course, that brings up
that's another conversation.
Q. Yeah, QAnon. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But related in many ways, actually. Can't go into that here. Next slide, please. Okay. Sometimes Nibiru takes on the persona of a second sun. It appears as a second sun beside our Sol, and that's due to the sun's light bouncing off the dust cloud that covers Nibiru. Now, I don't know where these photos were taken. They would have been in the last few years. They were posted on the Zenith website, and you can clearly see something is going on in those photos. Second sun persona. Next slide. In Taiwan, a little over 10 years ago, there was this image which was actually captured, photographed, and broadcast on Taiwanese television. And this shot is actually a screenshot from Taiwanese TV. Now, they didn't, as far as I'm aware, they didn't explain it, or they did not say, yeah, this is Nibiru, but they just said something is going on, and here's a photo of what happened, in March of 2011. Next slide, please.
Looks like a cell dividing, doesn't it? There.
Looks like a what?
A cell dividing there.
Oh, cell dividing, yeah. Yeah, that's actually not bad, not a bad analogy. Yeah.
Wow.
As Nibiru continues its outbound journey from the inner solar system, it is becoming increasingly visible from the Earth, but the images are still far from spectacular. So this is a more recent image, Italy in March of 2019. Once again, at the 3 o'clock, between 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock position of the sun. Once again, just a small speck of light, nothing really spectacular. Next photo, next slide. Now here's some recent images of Nibiru. The one on the upper left side, was actually a reflection off of Air Force One taken in August of 2019. And you can clearly see there are two images of the sun, or actually, one is an image of the sun, the other is an image of Nibiru. The one beside it is...
Sorry, Zachary. Interesting numerology on Air Force One there too.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. And then Vermont, from July 2019, you can see to the left of the sun, Nibiru complex. And then from Wales, from 2019, you can also see something to the left of the sun. So yes, we're starting to get more and more of these photographs in recent years. Next slide, please.
Wow.
This is the most spectacular photo we have to date. Sunrise, Nibiru rise over Cincinnati, Ohio. the first day of October 2019. Clearly something is going on. Clearly. Next slide, please. Can you go up a little bit? Because at the bottom of this, oh, back. Okay, for whatever reason you can't go up. Never mind.
Not sure. No.
During the past 12, I'll just read it. During the past 12 to 18 months, Nibiru-related photos and sightings have often involved the long, wafting trash tail or moon chain extending below Nibiru. And once again, as I mentioned a while back at the beginning of the lecture, this tail of Nibiru, which can waft a long way from Nibiru itself, is extremely important in understanding the effect of Nibiru on the Earth. Very important. We'll talk about this more. Now, that tail is highly light reflective and has large amounts of petrol bubbles within it, as we'll see. In recent months, many photos of petrol blobs burning in the atmosphere have emerged, but of course the mainstream media not reporting any of that. Next slide, please.
Surprise.
Okay, getting closer to home, Sunshine Coast, Queensland in late August 2020, just a little over a year ago. What you can see on the right is the sun, and you can see on the left this amorphous conglomeration of light. That's not actually Nibiru, it's the tail of Nibiru reflecting the light of the sun. If we were to actually be able to see a photograph of Nibiru, it would be very close to the sun on the right side. What we're seeing is the tail of the Nibiru reflecting sunlight. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a Zenith quote. What happens when a heavy petrol load is descending through the clouds over a fomenting volcano? And this is from April 14th of this year. A highly active tall volcano in the Philippines was blowing emissions skyward, and these emissions were often hot. The petrol drifting down through the lower atmosphere worldwide lately almost always dissipates or burns while descending. And in the next slide, you can see a close-up of this petrol mass, which is, how would you say it? It's separating the colors of light into rainbow colors. And I think this is from the film.
Like an oil slick.
Yeah, an oil slick, exactly right. That's the word I was looking for, the phrase I was looking for. Exactly right. Once again, this is becoming more and more apparent and visible around the world, and of course, not being reported by the mainstream media. Next slide, please.
I have seen more and more photographs showing things like that, just on the internet popping up.
Yeah, well, it's becoming undeniable, but there are a lot of them happening everywhere. All right, this is a photograph from Denver, Colorado, taken in March of 2021. Quote from Zenith: "These objects seen recently over Denver and elsewhere are not UFOs or any of mankind's craft. They do not seem to have a solid form at the tip of the dropping matter, and for a reason. These are dropping petrol masses, not satellite, because there has been no friction or spark to alight them. They are dissipating into the air around the mass, thus seeming to disappear." Next slide, please. Okay, this was photos taken in December of last year, 2020. Sarasota, Florida. And the Zenith comments are: "A petrol mass in the tail of Nibiru, large enough to block the light of the sun, first became apparent last November 8, 2020. This has rapidly progressed so that by December 2nd of that year, a petrol mass was captured on film from Sarasota, Florida, showing petrol masses charging over the horizon." Next slide, please. Okay, so much for the photos. We're going to talk about the major influence which Nibiru is having on the Earth and has had for many years past. In fact, since about 2003, when it first came into the inner solar system. All right, the magnetic pole of Earth is shifting much faster than scientists can explain. And you can see the diagram that, from 1900 to 1920 or even to 1940, there wasn't much movement. But if you look at a little further down the line from 2000 to 2020, there's been a huge movement of the magnetic North Pole of the Earth. Why is that? Scientists can't really explain it, or maybe they do know, they can explain it, but they don't want to acknowledge it. The North Magnetic Pole of Nibiru is pushing hard on the North Magnetic Pole of Earth, forcing it to move faster and further and faster than expected. Next slide, please. Further influence of Nibiru on the Earth, increased volcanic activity since 2003. And you can see in the top graph, that is, I think the year, it only goes up to 2000, 2003, yes, from 04 on upwards, especially till 2009, the last bar, it's significantly increased. And also the graph at the bottom. It's undeniable. In fact, we're hearing about more and more volcanic eruptions. There was one in Canary Islands just, I think, a few weeks ago. It's like almost every week or two passes with and a new volcanic eruption is reported somewhere in the world, including our friends over in New Zealand. We've been getting a lot of that recently.
So would the Schumann frequency be affected by that too?
It is indeed. It is indeed. I don't have any slides to cover that, but the Schumann frequency is definitely affected. Good point. Next slide, please. And there's been increased earthquake activity since 2003. And that, once again, is fairly obvious if you follow the news even superficially. The earthquake activity has been, exponentially increased in the last few years especially, but the last, 18 years since 2003. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about global warming and climate change. What is the truth about all of that? Well, as you may know, probably do know, there are two main scenarios and a fringe one being pushed by various groups in this discussion. Number one, the climatic changes and apparent extreme weather events being witnessed all around the Earth now and in recent years are not unusual or alarming. They are just part of the usual timely changes in the Earth's weather. And that's the view you hear from the right wing of politics, from the conservative right wing. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just part of an overall cycle. Scenario number two, climatic change and extreme weather events are directly related to global warming, in particular the greenhouse gases, and those, of course, are carbon dioxide and man-made carbon emissions being pumped into the atmosphere on a daily basis. You get that view coming from big business? Well, you get it coming from basically more progressive political spectrum, such as labor and, of course, the Greens. And then you get the fringe theory or fringe explanation, which doesn't have much of a credence anymore, but I'll mention it anyway. Number three, many climatic changes and most extreme weather events are caused by cutting-edge secret technology being used by governments, in particular HAARP and many HAARPs located in various regions of the Earth. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I'm not going to go, this was from a lecture I prepared in 2019, so I haven't really updated it, and I'm not going to go into the details, because if you want to go into those details, you'd be looking at a lecture 2 or 3 or 4 hours long. I mean, it's just happening everywhere you want to look. Next slide, please.
Well, we've had it recently in the Wombat Forest here, haven't we? It's all
that's it.
Been flattened.
So you look at hurricanes, wildfires, bushfires, America, Australia, Greece, other parts of Europe, it's just happening all over the place. Next slide, please.
Those Californian bushfires were very, very bizarre. Like trees didn't burn, but cars melted. It's very strange.
Yeah, well, there's an explanation for that. I can't go into that right now, but there is an explanation for that. Okay, what's the second scenario? Greenhouse gases and a global warming model are heating up the atmosphere. And that's widely presented in the media and by politicians. In fact, right now, as we speak, the COP26, Council of the People 26 climate conference in Glasgow is in session. We see delegates from all over the world discussing global climate change. As we saw in previous conferences, especially Paris 2015, Paris Agreements, Paris Accords, etc. Okay, the claim is that human-made carbon dioxide and other gas emissions are causing a greenhouse effect, which is wreaking havoc on normal temperatures and weather patterns around the world. Next slide, please. But let's take a look at the record-breaking cold temperatures. And apparently, it got colder than parts of the planet Mars. In February 2019, it hit Chicago in the state of Michigan and killed 21 persons as a result. And you can see the slide there, I think, is of a river or waterfall, which is basically frozen solid. I mean, it was cold, you know, and 21 people died as a result of that. Next slide, please.
Well, Texas recently froze over, didn't they? Unexpected.
What?
Texas had a big
Texas
freeze snap. Yeah, a few 6
Okay,
months
well,
ago.
I have some relatives there, actually. I didn't hear about that, but could be. Okay, did you know that many nations in Europe recently experienced their coldest spring, that would be March to May 2021, in 99 years? Cold. Now, what does that indicate about global warming? Well, I'm sorry, folks, in my opinion, it trashes that theory, that claim. It rubbishes it. This should not be happening if the planet is warming up. Simply should not be happening. Next slide. Okay, the third view, which is fringe or conspiracy, HAARP installations like the one in Gakona, Alaska, are using cutting-edge technology to experiment with weather control and thus causing climatic change extremes. But that is discounted when you think that in 2015, control of the HAARP facility passed from the U.S. Air Force to the University of Alaska. And that theory now is not, you don't hear much of it even in sort of so-called conspiracy theory circles. Next slide.
I think you can often even see it in the shape of the clouds, like it looks like frequency. Yeah.
Oh, well, it could be when you get a complex this large. I mean, you can see it's massive, and they're shooting ions and EMR up into the atmosphere. You're going to get some sort of effect locally, that's for sure. Okay. How have the powers that be, and I refer to them as the predatory elite, and that basically refers to multimillionaires and billionaires club. How have they gotten away with misinforming the public about what is really going on? Okay, the common term used is climate change. I much prefer the phrase climatic change extremes. And these are real, they're not fantasy, they're not part of a normal pattern or whatever, no. We're getting climatic change extremes everywhere you look. It is through this very cunning, seductive equation which underlines all comments on the matter, but it's never actually stated or written as such. And this is very, very important to understand. Climate change equals global warming. That's what the powers that be, that's what governments, that's what scientists, that's what everyone in charge wants you and me and the masses to believe. Climate change equals global warming. Next slide. Okay, as mentioned, the equation has never been printed or explicitly stated as such by politicians or the media. And that's because one part of the equation is verifiable, true, and correct, while the other part is non-verifiable, false, and incorrect. But which is which? What do you reckon, Jojo?
I believe the climate is always changing. They've been very, very cunning with their words, because it used to be global warming, now it's climate change, but climate's always changing.
Yeah.
It's trickery.
Well, my view is that climate change, or once again, I prefer the phrase climatic change extremes to climate change. But you can use both because they are actually correct. It's a reality. It's happening. But global warming is the hoax.
Yeah, I feel we're going into a mini ice age. That's what I've gotten to in my research thus far.
Well, certainly if you looked at what happened in Europe this spring, you would be tempted to make that conclusion because it was very, very cold. Now, can you acknowledge the extreme cunning and genius of the predatory elite in getting millions and billions of persons around the world to accept this unwritten, unspoken equation as true and scientifically accurate?
Mm-hmm.
They've done a great job.
Mm-hmm.
You have to hand it to them. They have done a great job in misinforming the public.
They are master manipulators, aren't they?
Absolutely right.
Mm.
Yep, next one. Okay, this is the Zenith explanation. And excuse me while I get a prop. Okay, the Zenith explanation. The daily axial rotation of the Earth is moving erratically or eccentrically. And that is called, usually referred to as the daily Earth wobble. That's caused by the interaction of Nibiru with the Earth's north magnetic pole. Now, I'll try to demonstrate. It's a complex movement, not easily explainable, but I'll try to use this soccer ball as to make my point. Pretend that this is the North Pole, and we're rotating. Pretend that I'm Nibiru, my head is Nibiru, and this is the Earth. As the North Pole of the Earth comes into direct alignment with the North Pole of Nibiru, there's a push back, because like repels like in the magnetic world. And then as the Earth continues to spin, there's a bounce back or a correction happening. So in effect, what you get, if you could draw a line through the Earth's polar axis pointing into space, it takes the form of a figure-8 movement, as you can see in the diagram below. India face, New Zealand face, North America face, and Italy face. It's hard to visualize it, it's hard to explain it, but that's actually what is happening. The daily axial rotation, instead of basically pointing in one direction, is moving in a figure-8 pattern. Now, that is the real cause of global climatic change extremes and destructive weather events according to Zenith. Next slide, please. So it's a daily Earth wobble, and that started with Nibiru's entry into the inner solar system in March 2003. And it's been getting more extreme ever since. That's the real cause of global climatic extremes. And they include both record-breaking hot and cold temperatures and related weather extremes. But the global warming theory basically ignores the fact that we're getting extremes at the cold end, the cold temperature end. They don't want to talk about that. So the whole theory basically collapses, in my opinion.
It's a bit
Next slide.
inconvenient for their narrative, isn't it?
Well, that's why they don't want to talk about it.
That's right.
Okay. The daily Earth wobble explanation is that anywhere on the globe, when the movement exposes that region to more sunlight than usual, there's a rise in the temperatures in that region, sometimes very much above the seasonal norm. The reverse is also true. When any region receives seasonally less sunlight than normal, there's a drop in the temperatures there, and sometimes very much below average. That's why we were seeing both extremes, record-breaking extremes, both hot and cold temperatures in any given region, and often within the same year. But the scientists and climate change experts who are under the control or management of the predatory elite simply won't tell us the truth in that regard. Next slide, please. Okay, here's a photo taken on August 26th, that's this year, 2021, at 5:15 p.m. in Idaho, northern state in the United States. It proves the daily Earth wobble. It's the second set of confirmed photo taken at the moment of wobble. The wobble happens quickly, can even be within a minute. You can see either the sun is moving strangely in the sky, or our vantage point of the sun here on Earth is wobbling or moving erratically. So we've got it on film, we've got the pictures, but of course the powers that be don't want to talk about this because they don't want you or I to know. And the reasons for that we'll get to a little bit later. Next slide, please. All right, let's take two events that happened in the year 2018 from Calgary, which is the capital of the province of Alberta, and that's in Western Canada. Next slide. Okay, on the 11th of August of that year, and that's summer in the Northern Hemisphere, Calgary experienced its highest temperature on record. And this is from the local news report. 36.4 degrees centigrade shortly after 5 p.m. And that broke the record of 36.1, which was in July 2019 and again in July 1933. Fast forward 2 months later to October 2018, Calgary may be only 11 short days into the month of October, but thanks to the immense amount of snowfall we saw earlier this month, we've already broken some weather records. With just under 45 centimeters of snow falling in one day on October 2nd, comes as no surprise that the few flurries we've had since have been enough to put us over the edge. So from August to October, same year, 2018, hottest temperature, most snowfall. Next slide, please. Due to the interaction of the electromagnetic and gravitational fields of Nibiru and the Earth, the molten core of Earth is heating up. And that's a very, very significant factor behind the reported temperature raises in oceans and land masses. And those reported temperature raises are not fantasy or fiction. They are actually happening. They're real. But that's the real reason the Great Barrier Reef off according to Zenith. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about what happens when the Earth's axis, daily axis, moves erratically or eccentrically, yeah. The boundary between day and night at any given time and place on Earth is a moving line or division called the Solar Terminator, as you can see in the diagram. Sunlight illuminating half the Earth, the other half is in darkness because it's on the other side of the sun. It's well known. Next slide, please. Well, in July 2018, due to the daily Earth wobble, some regions in Siberia in northern Russia actually experienced night-like darkness in the middle of a summer's day. Now, this is from the blue type is from a translation of the local report. Anyway, these are three districts. I won't try to pronounce their names. Saw their day turn into complete darkness for about 3 hours on July 20th, 2018. The region was hit by bizarre darkness between 11:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. local time Friday. So what's the explanation? Why did this happen? Well, this is the Zenith explanation at the bottom. Did the globe have a severe wobble on July 24th? It actually should have been the 20th. Enough to cause a temporary day into night for a part of Siberia. At high noon, when sunlight should be expected for the duration of the day, the Zygansky district of Siberia went pitch dark. This gloom was not caused by cloud cover, despite any claims made to excuse the obvious wobble. What happened was that part of the Earth, Siberia, flipped over across the Solar Terminator and went into night for a few hours, and then it came back in the day. Next slide, please. And guess what? The next month, August 2018, the same thing happened at Grand Prairie and Valley View in central Alberta in Canada, namely darkness appearing during the middle of a summer's day. And you can see the photographs there. On the left, dusk, and on the right, total blackness. So what was the explanation? According to Zenith, the daily Earth wobble is known to tilt the Americas southward in what is called a bounce back from the previous day's polar push. But these matters are not always smooth, resulting in a wobble too far at times with adjustments. The bounce back on this day, August 17th, went too far, and the globe compensated by flinging to the north. Thus, for a few hours, day became night for the puzzled residents of central Alberta. Or in other words, they flipped over the line of the Solar Terminator and went into darkness for a few hours before it corrected and came back into daylight. Once again, you never heard a mention of this in the mainstream media. My friend in Canada did actually tell me that it was reported in the news there. I guess they had to, but it was blamed on smoke from nearby bushfires. That's the official explanation. Next slide, please. Okay, we are living through earth-shaking events, literally earth-shaking events, due to the daily Earth wobble. Now, the tectonic plates of the Earth are in a major movement. You won't hear this anywhere in the media. Scientists aren't talking about it. Heads of government aren't talking about it. No one's talking about it, except it's actually occurring. And that's what's causing a lot of these earthquakes and a lot of these volcanic eruptions and a lot of these strange weather events. Now, you can see how the tectonic plates of the Earth interlock and interlap in this diagram. We're on the left side of the diagram, Australia, you can see. And what is happening, basically, is thanks to the daily Earth wobble of the Earth caused by Nibiru, the tectonic plates of the Earth are rocking and rolling. They're shifting and shaking like we haven't seen for the last 3,500 years. In fact, since the last appearance of Nibiru 3,600 years ago. But you're not being told any of that, of course. Next slide. According to Zenith, the Indo-Australian plate is the break for all tectonic plates around the globe. And when it moves, the breaks come off right around the world. And you can see in both diagrams, the colored one on the left, the black and white one on the right, how the two plates, the Indian plate and the Australian plate, basically move as one. What is happening is that the Pacific plate, or the Fiji plate in the diagram, to our east, to the east of New Zealand, is moving under or subducting the eastern edge of the Indo-Australian plate. And that is pushing that edge of the plate higher. Meanwhile, on the left side, the western side of the Indo-Australian plate, that is subducting under the plate to the west, to the African plate. So our tectonic plate, the Indo-Australian plate, the break for the whole planet, is starting to move significantly and affecting all the tectonic plates around it. That is the real cause, the real reason for the increase in earthquakes and volcanoes and other related weather event extremes, according to Zenith. Next slide. Now we know during the 2019-2020 summer, Australia experienced many terrible bushfires that badly affected huge areas in 3 different states, and there was, I think, Perth got a few, so that maybe make it 4. What is the explanation for that from Zenith? This is a quote. Australia is dealing with plate movement consequences as the Indo-Australian plate is pushed under Tibet. It lifts at the New Zealand edge, that's the eastern edge of the plate, creating a void under the plate that hot molten lava rushes to fill. This temporary river of lava is heating Australia and warmed ocean currents to the east of New Zealand. Didn't read this in The Age, didn't read this in the Herald Sun, but this is the Zenith explanation. The eastern edge of our Indo-Australian plate is lifting, and the eastern part of Australia is not that far from the eastern edge, despite the fact that the eastern edge is basically off the coast of New Zealand. So a void was created, molten magma, lava rushed in to fill it. That in turn heated the landmass above that, and that in turn heated the air above the landmass. And that is a Zenith explanation for the terrible bushfires we had in 2019 and 2020. So, once again, there is absolutely no link absolutely no link between those bushfires and human-made carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere or biosphere. That's if you accept the Zenith explanation, as I obviously do. Next slide. Now this is interesting. From early January 2020, and this is a quote from some journal, I'm not sure where, mysterious hot blob of water off New Zealand coast baffles scientists. There's a similar unknown phenomenon off New Zealand producing a spike in water temperature of up to 6 degrees centigrade, above average across a massive passive ocean east of New Zealand. Why did that happen? It's because the eastern edge of the Indo-Australian plate, that eastern edge running off the east coast of the North Island and then cutting through the South Island at Christchurch, and that's why Christchurch has been hit by the earthquake, so many earthquakes and so strong earthquakes in the last couple of decades. That movement of the eastern edge caused the magma to fill in, to rush in, and the magma heated up the ocean above it. And that's why this unknown phenomena off New Zealand. But while all this was happening, and the focus of the media here in New Zealand was rightly on the terrible bushfires that were sweeping through Australia, guess what? In nearby India, they are experiencing the coldest day on record for this date. And then bizarre extremes continued for Europe, where Sweden experienced its warmest day on record for that date. Iceland was so devastated by 145 miles per hour wind and 10 feet of driving slow that livestock were buried up to their eyeballs. Now, I don't necessarily blame the local press for not reporting that, because all the attention rightly was on what we were experiencing here and the terrible crisis that we had to deal with, which we had to deal. But at the same time, that was all happening, extremes of heat and heat-related climatic change events in Australia. In other parts of the world, they were getting record cold. Does the global warming theory explain that? No way, Jose. No way, Jose. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, the Antarctic plate remains rock solid. Now, world leaders know all about what's actually going on. They know that Antarctica is solid, they know it's stable land, and they're sort of eyeing off how much of Antarctica that they can claim for themselves after the big event, which is the pole shift. Next slide, please. The billionaires and millionaires who own the mainstream media aren't telling us, and that's because they don't want us to know, is during the past few years, some very strange things have begun to surface from beneath the melting ice cap of Antarctica. Now, what appears to be a trench or a line or whatever, according to Zenith, that was actually a launching pad for Anunnaki spacecraft. The last time Nibiru hit town, which was about 1,600 BC. And that's been buried in the ice and snow for a long time now, because parts of Antarctica, most of it in fact, is melting. This stuff is coming up and being revealed. Oh, surprise, surprise, what's under the snows in Antarctica? Next slide, please. Now we've got this very, very interesting, unusual phenomena which has been revealed, I think, just within the last 12 months. It's the face in Antarctica.
Wow.
Pretty impressive. Pretty impressive.
Yeah, I'm
And
generally
curiously enough,
very fascinated by Antarctica, because no one can go there ever since Admiral Byrd gave it a go back in whenever that was. Yeah, we just don't hear anything from there. It's all kept very hidden, so I'm very curious.
well, the major powers taking their claims, you see. And they don't want you or I to know about that, but that's another story. Now, next slide, please. Do you happen to remember what Richard Hoagland, the American scientist, astrophysicist Dr. Richard Hoagland was talking about back in the 1980s. He was talking about the face on Mars. And could we go back to the previous slide, the face on Antarctica? And then flip back to the Hoagland slide? Guess what, folks? There's a similarity. They are similar. They're not identical, but they're similar. So something's going on. Something's going on. Of course, the media have been completely silent about the face of Antarctica. They don't want people to know about it, obviously. Next slide. Okay, what will happen as the daily Earth wobble continues to get extreme? Well, according to Zenith talk, we're heading toward a major pole shift of planet Earth to about 90 degrees from what it is now. And according to their prediction, believe it or not, you have to make up your own mind, this is what the new Earth will look like after the pole shift. The equator will stretch from Antarctica to the Arctic, and there will be new land emerging where the Arctic now exists. That will be the new equator. Which is interesting if you look at how Australia is going to fare, because that means that the whole eastern coast of Australia will suddenly find itself in approximately the position that central Queensland is at present. So if this is correct, and you have to decide for yourself whether you want to accept it or not, that's up to you, the whole east coast of Australia will find itself in a climatic change extreme where the climate is similar to what central Queensland experiences now. And you can see the other continents are changed. Now, the new south pole of planet Earth will be just south of India, probably somewhere around Sri Lanka. The new north pole will be off the bulge of eastern South America, and that's Brazil. So those are the new poles, new equator, and there are going to be some winners out of all of this. I mean, look at Scandinavia. Norway, Finland, Sweden. They're going to all of a sudden be a tropical place. It's going to be a big change for them. If you accept it, and we have to see. We have to see if this becomes a reality or not. Next slide, please. This is what the new Earth will look like according to Zenith. In the top diagram, you can see that most of India and Sri Lanka will have gone down, disappeared beneath the waves. That's a prediction. Why is that? Well, because they're on the western edge of the Indo-Australian plate, and that Indo-Australian plate is subducting, diving under the plate to the west of it, which is the African plate. So that part of the world is going to lose elevation and go under. You can see that in the second diagram, that a lot of South America is gone as well.
And a lot of Australia.
Especially Western Europe is not looking so good. And Africa seems to be the most intact. Excuse me?
Australia is, there's not much landmass left there.
Yeah, the bad news for Australia is that 2/3 of the western part of this island continent is predicted to go down. So if you happen to be in Perth and you're hearing this, not good news. If you believe it, you might want to think about moving. That's up to you, of course. Next slide. What is the Zenith prediction for Australia after the pole shift? Quote, Australia will be in a good and bad situation regarding the pole shift. The western 2/3 will go suddenly underwater due to a plate shared with India sliding under the Himalayas. And that's the western part of the Indo-Australian plate. But the eastern half of Australia and New Zealand benefit from this plate movement, lifting up as India is plunged under the Himalayas. Thus, even with rising seas from melting poles, the mountains in eastern Australia and New Zealand will afford safe living areas. Due to its attachment to the plate, including India, the continent of Australia will both suffer and benefit from the coming pole shift. Bottom line is, you don't want to be in WA, folks. You want to be somewhere in the eastern states, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, or Tassie, if you want to survive the pole shift, if you believe that the pole shift is coming, and obviously I do. Next slide. This is a diagram from the talk of how things will look after the pole shift in Australia and New Zealand. You can see that most of the coastal areas will be flooded. Both Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and New Zealand. My personal belief is that this map is not 100% correct. I think some of the red areas in the Australian section, which are the underwater areas, or will be going underwater, they should be a little bit thinner or smaller than what they actually are. But generally speaking, this is a prediction for Australia after the pole shift, and New Zealand as well. Next slide.
I wonder if that would explain why a lot of the elites have been buying up in New Zealand, because they know this is coming, then that's some safe ground for them to be.
Well, I'll mention briefly, according to Zenith, the Queen is planning to flee here with her family and her helpers, because they know that most of the United Kingdom will be underwater.
Yeah, that was one of my questions coming up about the potentiality of that, just the descendants of the Anunnaki jump back on and bugger off, leave us in peace on the planet while it flings back around.
There's a lot going on, many plans in play now. Okay, this is a quote from Zenith. We have described the plunging of the western two-thirds of Australia as quite dramatic and steep. Meanwhile, the eastern part levels off due to a bending of the plate to the center of Australia. This can almost be seen if one looks at a relief map of Australia, as the lowlands of Australia, where the bending occurs, are between the eastern and western mountain ranges. This is heavy lifting, and more than mere bending in the center of Australia can alleviate. Top diagram is a worm's eye view if you were on the Queensland border, the southern Queensland border of Queensland looking north. You can see the bend. You can see where New Zealand is on the right, Coral Sea. You can see the one bend, two-thirds of the way through, another bend, and India to the west. If you're a worm on the Victoria, New South Wales border and looking north in New South Wales, that's what they would are predicted to experience. Now, is this just mere theory? Wishful thinking? Fantasy? Oh, let's take a look at the next slide. Well, guess what? On the 22nd of December, just a day before the spring equinox here, we got a little quake. We got a little shake and a little quake. Well, it wasn't actually that little. It was one of the strongest this area has had, I read, since Confederation. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I read in the media, if you can believe it. This is a quote from a news report. The quake's epicenter was near the rural town of Mansfield in the state of Victoria, about 200 kilometers northeast of Melbourne. It was at a depth of about 10 kilometers, and aftershock was rated 4.0. Now, anyone living in Victoria would have heard about this. Most people around Australia would have heard about this. So why did that happen? Next slide. The Zenith explanation is Australia will lift as the Indo-Australia plate plunges under the Himalayas. Thus, Australia will rise on the eastern edge while it sinks on the western side. Due to the steep rise expected across Australia, the weight of the landmass of Australia will force this continent to bend in the middle. Australia will bend along a line under the central lowlands, which are a thin place in the crust, approximately 2/3 of the way across the continent. That's from west to east, moving from Perth towards Sydney. This recent quake at Melbourne is not this bending of the Indo-Australian plate, but a precursor. How interesting. It's not the big bend. It's just a little tickle, just a little precursor. So the big bend, the big movement is still yet to come, according to Zenith. The mini quakes during the rise of the eastern edge of the Indo-Australian plate are clustered along New Zealand and Indonesia, and that should be obvious. Next slide, please. Okay, if all that happens as predicted, or most of it happens as predicted, the question then becomes, the huge, big, humongous question becomes, what will be the timeline? Zenith has refused to give a timetable for those events to unfold, and there are reasons for that, but they're too complex to go into here. Until recently, that is. Next slide. Here's my speculation or best guess, and I really don't know when it will come to pass, but the unfolding timetable. But it's going to be, as far as I'm aware, as far as my understanding goes, sometime between 2023 and 2026. And that's not very far off.
Which is when Pluto moves into Aquarius. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Hmm.
Yep. Could well be. But I have to say, don't quote me on this one, because the reality is that only God, him or herself, truly knows when it's going to happen. I'm not even sure Zenith knows for sure, although they've indicated that 2026 is their preferred date. I personally think it's going to be sooner than that. I'm looking at 2023, but the reality is no one knows for sure. No one knows for sure. But the main thing is, this is not very far in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, our good friends, the predatory elite, the multimillionaires and billionaires of the world, not all of them. There's some decent multimillionaires and billionaires. Not many, in my opinion, but there are some, I reckon. What are they planning to do to survive the pole shift? Well, they've been preparing secret hideouts and bunkers in many nations, stocked with food and supplies for some years now. They know about the reality of the coming pole shift. They know this. They believe it. They know it's going to happen. But they don't want you or me or the masses to know anything about that. Their plan is to emerge after the big event to reassert control over their shattered nations, using their immense wealth as a power tool.
I have seen some incredible...
That answers the question you asked earlier, why don't they want us to know? Because they're planning to take over, folks.
I have seen some incredible images of underground bunkers and the absolute luxury of setups going on deep underground.
Yeah. Yep. Well, they're preparing their little underground palaces. Okay. In the meantime, there are a huge number of events and circumstances that are occurring all around the planet which are indicative of the influence of Nibiru on our Earth. None of those are being reported by the mainstream media. That's because the mainstream media is owned by the multimillionaires and billionaires of the world, the predatory elite, and they want to keep us all ignorant. Simple.
The fake stream media. Yeah, don't believe a word they say.
For instance, the Lomanossa Explosions, which we've seen in recent years in the upper atmosphere of the Earth. And this is a quote from Zenith. What are these explosions on the edge of the upper atmosphere, or the atmosphere and outer space meet? Never before seen, unexplained by mankind scientists, these explosions were sighted by a Russian satellite, the Lomanossa satellite, and photographed. They're called red sprites, and blue jets are known, always associated with lightning and atmospheric turmoil below storms. Okay, red sprites and blue jets have been seen in the lower atmosphere before. But the Lomanossa explosions are not associated with either lightning or storms. They're in the upper atmosphere, not the lower atmosphere.
So
Next slide.
the sprites there being red and the jets being blue, is that to do with the electromagnetic
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, positive and
And
negative
the color
charges?
spectrum and how those EMR fragments or emissions hit the spectrum, the visual spectrum. Yeah, it's all to do with that. Have we heard about the thunderbolts of the gods? Strange, trumpeting, clapping sounds heard in various parts of the world. Well, according to Zenith, we have detailed that lightning will pass from the earth to Nibiru during the passage, causing what the ancients called the thunderbolts of the gods, trumpeting due to splits in the upper atmosphere clapping back together. These phenomena do not just suddenly emerge one day, but manifest gradually. And as a related phenomenon to the thunderbolts of the gods, I don't have a slide for this, we have heard reports, and there are videos you can look at on YouTube or other places, in which there's strange grinding noises or groaning.
That's so. Just as I said before, we started recording, Zachary. The Yellowstone National Park is just—they're talking about strange sounds like metal crashing, like humming,
It's being twisted and
singing.
turned, and you get this movement of rock against rock, and that's creating these sound waves.
Interesting.
Now that's been reported locally. Yeah, I remember a video I saw some years ago of a professional baseball game down in Florida, and you could clearly hear in the background this sort of groaning sound. And yeah, they didn't explain it, of course. They wouldn't have known themselves what it was. But it's not been reported in the international press. Once again, they don't want you to know. Simple as that. Next slide, please. Do you remember the thunderstorm asthma from November 2016?
Mm-hmm.
8 people died in Australia, all of them in Victoria, I believe. This is a quote from a news report. There are at least 8,500 people treated due to the thunderstorm, many experiencing breathing problems. 410 people who experienced thunderstorm asthma symptoms had not been diagnosed with asthma. Okay, well, they're getting thunderstorm asthma symptoms, but they didn't have any previous record of asthma. A very unusual weather occurrence, thunderstorm asthma is triggered by large storms that can cause significant breathing problems, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's nonsense, of course. The Zenith explanation, which I happen to believe is much more correct, where dust storms can stir up pollen, they do not create pollen asthma in people who previously did not have asthma. Yes. The issue here is not the rain or pollution, but particulate in the vast hail of Nibiru, which is wafting the Earth increasingly. Nibiru is slightly south of the Earth's ecliptic, and due to the polar push of the daily Earth wobble, Australia gets a lot of this tail waft. Normally, the dusty tail trash lands and lies on the ground where it can be collected during a dust storm. Will such storms continue? They will, in fact, increase and may become common in the near future in other countries with a southern exposure to. Okay, thunderstorm asthma, cover up on the part of the mainstream media and the medical authorities. They know what's really going on. Once again, they don't want you or I to know about it. Next slide, please. Are you aware that animal albinism is much on the increase around the world in recent years? You can see here photographs from the state of Idaho, Poland, looks like a bush turkey from Australia, down in Tassie they had one, Canada, UK and Ohio, so it's about everywhere. Next slide, please.
Does that then maybe potentially relate to the white buffalo calf prophecy, like the albino animals all appearing on the planet, that it heralds something?
Well, the next slide actually has a reference to the white buffalo, so...
Okay.
Okay, albinos are on the increase. Since the white buffalo emerged, a plethora of albinos have emerged on all continents and almost all species. Per the Zenith, this is caused by a genetic switch being thrown that reacts to emissions from the core of the Earth. This signals the critter that is likely living in a cave, no need for coloration to protect it from the sun. So they're getting a biological signal, a biological message. Oh, before you were exposed to sunlight, and now you were in a region of much less sunlight, so you don't need the protection. You can go pale. And that's what is happening. Once again, not being reported by the media, but what else is new? Next slide, please. All right. Now, you have been presented with some basic facts about Nibiru and its approach to Earth, and how much effects it is causing here. It is up to you to decide. It is up to you to decide whether you believe much or some or any of that, or on the other hand, whether you choose to dismiss the entire matter as fantasy. That is your choice. If you reckon there's some truth in the matters that have been discussed, then I would highly advise you to prepare for what is to come as best as you are able. Next slide. First and foremost, keep up the personal and spiritual practice that you find most suitable for you and most inspiring. It's very, very important. Those who have found their spiritual center, however, that is expressed, will be the ones who can best survive what is coming and manage to keep their sanity. Now, on a practical level, I would highly advise that you consider putting together a 3 to 6 month food supply in your home. That can be easily done. Got a lot of good food outlets in Victoria and other states, so that's not hard to do. Next slide, please. Also important is to learn how to garden, to grow vegetables or fruit if you have the space. There's a lot to learn about all that. Even if you live in a place where there's no space for a normal garden, you can grow veggies in pots with soil. And after the pole shift, or even in the weeks leading up to it, when the normal transportation network we rely on for food will be severely disrupted, but especially after the pole shift when it's going to disappear altogether, you and I and everyone else who survives that big event and who wants to keep living on the planet is going to have to learn about food production, personal food production. We're all going to have to go into that line of work, like it or not. Next slide, please. If you want to grow good veggies, you better consider starting your own seed bank, no matter how small they may be, with a good supply of garden seeds, preferably organic. And there are a number of companies here in Australia that supply good seeds.
Diggers.
Okay, from the second paragraph, those groups who have prepared and are relying on themselves and their own carefully tended gardens will not find themselves pinched between starvation and hostilities. Humans have but to return to their recent past and relearn these lessons. Except for those few who have prepared, humans surviving the cataclysms will find themselves without food. And that is a dire prediction and prophecy. I believe it's going to come true. Everyone has to decide for themselves. And the last paragraph, are you planning a garden this year? Have you purchased the tools and seed? Have you educated yourself on how to save seed and what the best produce for your climate and region might be? Or have you considered keeping chickens or goats? Very, very important practical things to follow if you believe that the pole shift is coming, and if you believe that it's going to basically knock out the technology basis upon which we are relying so heavily in our current civilization.
And I believe, regardless of what's happening in moving forward, that those things should be a priority. I'm happy to say I'm doing most of those things already.
Absolutely right.
But yeah, being self-sufficient and sustainable is
excellent.
Yeah, is the way forward.
Very good. Okay. If the predictions about a pole shift in the near future come to pass, which I certainly believe they will, that will basically mean the end of our technology-based civilization. And that means those who can provide their own power through solar power systems or wind will be able to keep powering the electrical devices that we use every day and pretty much take for granted. That's why I recommend, if you can afford it, the installation of solar power or wind power on homes to cut the dependency on the power grid. If you have that spare cash, that spare money, that is, I would say, pretty much an essential. Not everyone can afford it, of course, which is sad, but those who can, they should get ready. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide in the presentation. Despite the challenges of what I reckon will be coming down in the next few years, I wish you all good luck in your endeavors. Remember that preparation, whether it's spiritual or psychological or emotional or practical, all those levels of preparation, they will be the key. Those who are prepared before and after the pole shift will be relatively happy, whereas those who choose to trust the authorities, governments, mainstream media, scientists, etc., will be frowning a lot after the big event. And that is the end of the presentation.
Fantastic. That's so much info, Zachary. That was fantastic. There's a lot to chew on there. But,
There's a lot. There's a lot to take in. And if you believe that a pole shift is coming, even more incentive to do that. Yeah, even more incentive.
Well, so should we get together and do another one soon, Zachary?
Yeah, well, one I'd like to do is on the Nibiru cover-up and how it relates to the coronavirus hoax pandemic and the rollout of the COVID-19 inoculations, because that's an issue which is preoccupying pretty well everyone at the moment.
Absolutely.
And of course, what we're being told about is the reality of that has nothing to do with the actual reality of the situation, as per usual.
That would be a fantastic.
So yeah, that would be fairly important, I reckon.
Let's do that then. But thank you so much for your time today. I've certainly got a lot to chew on and maybe go and look a few things up and cross-reference and double-check. But yeah, I can't even think of any questions at the moment.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much, Zachary. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Jojo, and thanks for the opportunity to spread the information to the world.
Yeah.
To you and the rest of the world.
Let's get it out there. Whoop, I don't
Indeed.
know what I'm doing with the screen here, but whoop, whoop. All right. Blessings, Zachary. We'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. All the best.